Welcome to the Corinne True Center for Baha'i History. The center was established by the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States in January of 2024. Its purpose is to foster the study of Baha'i history, Baha'i sacred texts, Baha'i philosophical and theological concepts, and world religions from a Baha'i and comparative perspective. I am Robert Stockman, the director of the center. Joining me today is Dr. Moojan Momen, who lives in the United Kingdom and is a retired medical doctor by profession. In his spare time, if you want to call it that, it's most of his time now, he likes to study Baha'i history and other aspects of the Baha'i faith. He's also studied Islam, especially Shi'i Islam, and the phenomenon of religion in general. He is married with 2 children and 2 grandchildren. He's published quite a few books, and I won't try to list them all now, but his most recent books have been a 2-volume history of the Baha'i communities of Iran, which he edited, and he also edited and contributed to the history of the Baha'i community of the British Isles. Both of those books, or all 3 of those books, have been published by George Ronald. Today, he is going to be giving us a description of the growth of the Baha'i faith in the British Isles based on the work that he did for this second book, The Baha'i Community of the British Isles. So, Moojan, welcome to the Corinne True Center for Baha'i History. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to hearing your presentation today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rob, for your introduction and also for inviting me to make this presentation, and also thank you to those of you who are joining us for this, and also any who are listening to this at a later date on the recording. The title of my presentation, as you can see on the screen, is an analysis of 2 growth spurts of the British Baha'i community. This is extracted from a book that, as Rob was mentioning, I edited and contributed to, and came out, published by George Ronald towards the end of last year, called The Baha'i Community of the British Isles. This is a picture of the front cover, and as you can see, there are 4 contributors: Adam Thorne, myself, Janet Rose, Fleming Rose, and Earl Redman. And this presentation today will be mainly extracted from, the first half is from work that I did, and the second half is based on the data that Adam Thorne collected and presented towards the end of the book. Okay, so let's get started. The British Baha'i community began in 1899 upon the return to London of 2 American women who were resident in London and who had been to visit Abdu'l-Baha as part of the first pilgrimage of Western Baha'is to Abdu'l-Baha. And they weren't Baha'is when they set out, but by the time they came back, they were followers of Abdu'l-Baha and Baha'is, although in those days, of course, the definition of who was a Baha'i was fairly loose, and so there was no registration or anything. But you can say that they were Baha'is, and they returned and told one of their English friends about it. And these 3 began activities to promote the new religion in 1899, and we can say that that is the start of the British Baha'i community. And during the first half century of its existence, the British Baha'i community experienced 2 growth spurts, which are the subject of my presentation today. And on this graph, you can see the 2 growth spurts, starting from 1910, 1911. You have one going up to 1923. Then there was a period of 20 years when, or just over 20 years, when there was no growth at all. And then another spurt over a 6-year period from basically 1944, although in fact 1945, because there hadn't been any growth from 44 to 45 either. So from 1945 to 1950, so over a 5-year period, there was then another spurt of growth. And although it didn't flatten off after that, it wasn't as vigorous a growth in the period after 1950. So the question that I'm raising in this presentation, and these are the figures that that graph represents. You can see down the middle of the table the column that says adult Baha'is, and you look at the left-hand column, which are the dates. You can see that from 1910 to 1923 to 6 it went up from 25 to 118, which is the first growth spurt. And then if you take the 1945 figure of 118 and the one of 1950, over that 5 years, the number of Baha'is went up from 118 to 340, and the number of assemblies went up from 5 to 24. So there was almost a tripling of the number of Baha'is and almost a quadrupling of the number of assemblies. And in that earlier period, again, there was about a tripling of the number of Baha'is. Okay, so those are the figures, those are the two growth spurts. And the question is that why was there the first spurt between 1911 and 1923? And then after 20 years of no growth at all, why was there another spurt between 1945 and 1950? When there was a 5-fold number increase in the number of assemblies and a tripling of the number of tripling of the number of Baha'is. So we're going to take the first period first and look at why the numbers may have tripled between 1911 and 1923. Well, the obvious answer to that is that Abdu'l-Baha's visit occurred at the beginning of that period, and it would seem fairly obvious that that was the reason for this tripling of numbers. But the fact is that in the course of my researches into this period, I was unable to find a single British Baha'i whose life story says that they met Abdu'l-Baha or attended one of his talks in Britain during this period of 1911 to 1913 and became a Baha'i at that time. We've got a good number of Baha'is, I think 5 or 6, who met Abdu'l-Baha at this time in Britain, but became Baha'is years later, in one case 40 years later, when they encountered the Baha'i community again. We have a few Baha'is, British Baha'is, who became Baha'is as a result of meeting Abdu'l-Baha, but it was not while he was in Britain, it was elsewhere, in the case of several of them in France. But I couldn't find a single British Baha'i whose life story says that they met Abdu'l-Baha and became a Baha'i in that period when he was in Britain. There's a slight caveat with this, because we actually have very few biographical accounts of the early British Baha'is in this period. There was no periodical publication by the British Baha'is. There was no journal where you might have got obituaries of Baha'is who've passed away. So we actually have very few biographical accounts, and there are 1 or 2 individuals who one wonders whether they may have become Baha'is during Abdu'l-Baha's visit. Grace Crosby is one that springs to mind. We don't know how she became a Baha'i or even when she became a Baha'i, but it's possible that she may have become a Baha'i after she attended one of the talks of Abdu'l-Baha. We just don't know. We haven't got anyone whom we can firmly say became a Baha'i at that time. And we have another clue that perhaps not very many did become Baha'is during Abdu'l-Baha's visit, because there is this passage from Florence George, who was one of the people who was a Baha'i during this time, during Abdu'l-Baha's visit, and reflecting some 25 years later, she wrote, "While we stand aghast with amazement that the crowds of people who met Abdu'l-Baha should have lost all interest in the movement, we must ask ourselves, what have we done, who with more opportunity and the privilege of understanding did it's hidden under my thing, so I can't say what the next line says. But anyway, the important thing is this first 3 lines, that the 4 lines that say that as far as she's concerned, all those crowds of people who met Abdu'l-Baha, they all lost interest in the movement. So that's another clue that there was no great influx of Baha'is during the visit of Abdu'l-Baha. So if it wasn't during this period of 1911, let's say, to 1913 or 1914, when Abdu'l-Baha was visiting, and the year immediately after that, when did this tripling of numbers between 1911 and 1923 happen? Well, it's very difficult to think that it happened during 1914 to 18, when the First World War was going on, because that period was a very difficult period for a religion that was preaching world peace and unity. This was war years. There was ultra-nationalism. There was instilling of hatred of others as part of the war process of gearing people up for war, and a religion that preached peace would have difficulty in getting their message across, if you like. So it's difficult to say that this was the cause of this, that any great number would have come in 1914 to 18. And after the World War between 1919 and 1923, when we have this set of numbers of being 112 Baha'is in 1923. By the way, I should mention that these numbers that I gave and that graph that I gave are of adult Baha'is, because they're mainly drawn from voting lists, so it's not including children. We only have a 4-year period from 1919 to 1923, maybe 5 years, and during that 5 years, as far as I can tell, there was no growth in numbers in London. I don't know of a single person who became a Baha'i in that period in London. There was some growth in Bournemouth, where John Esselmont had started the Bournemouth Baha'i community, but that could not have been more than about 8 or 9, well, in fact, 7 or 8 people. And again, in Manchester, there was some growth in the community, but again, it was only about 7 or 8 people. So that would only account for 15 of the 70 or more who, 80 or more who became Baha'is in this period. So we haven't got any satisfactory answer as to when the tripling of numbers occurred, and with nothing else to go on, we come back to the possibility that maybe it was Abdu'l-Baha's visit in 1911 to 1913, the 2 visits that he made, one in 1911 and one over the winter of 1912 to 13 to Britain, that achieved this great increase in numbers, this quadrupling of the numbers. And that was a major achievement for Abdu'l-Baha, because he arrived in this country with little knowledge of English, no experience of public speaking, little experience of Western culture, and representing a little-known religious movement with no history or culture behind it. And yet, despite this, he managed to achieve unprecedented interest from prominent people, unprecedented interest from organizations in civil society and from church groups. I don't know whether you can see the last line of my slide here. I seem to be missing the last line of my slides, but there is another line underneath this line that says unprecedented interest from newspapers. And I'm just going to look at that in a little bit more detail. The unprecedented, taking the first 2 together, the prominent people and the organizations and churches that were became interested in Abdu'l-Baha during his visits. This was basically the work of the British Baha'is before Abdu'l-Baha's arrival, because in this period up from, say, 1900 to 1911, when Abdu'l-Baha first arrived, Britain was at the height of its empire, but there was a crisis of doubt at the heart of British society about traditional Christianity, which was the moral and spiritual foundations of that empire. And this has been caused by a number of factors in the late 19th century. Biblical criticism that pointed out, for example, the contradictions within the text of the Bible, which made it more and more difficult to believe that somehow this was a divine text. Geological evidence that seemed to contradict what the Bible said about the age of the earth. The theory of evolution, which appeared to many people to again cast doubt on the biblical story. And also things like the evidence of poverty in Britain, that, you know, here was a Christian society and that yet there was this gross amount of poverty on the streets of London, which had been pointed out to people by, for example, the novelist Charles Dickens's novels highlighting this poverty. So all of this had thrown people into turmoil, and there was, as a result, a frenetic search for a new moral and spiritual foundation compatible with science and being a foundation that was more socially aware, especially among upper class and upper middle class women. The reason for that is that social conditions meant that these women, most of them, couldn't work and had little to occupy their time, and so they had plenty of time on their hands to explore hundreds of new movements that emerged in this period trying to address these issues. And the early Baha'is matched this profile. They were, most of them were upper middle class women with time on their hands. Some were upper class, some were lower middle class, and a few working class people, men and women. These early British Baha'is had a very wide range of interests, and they were involved with many groups. People like Lady Blomfield, Alice Buckton, and Wesley Tudor Pole really had a very wide profile of interests and groups that they were interacting with, and they could talk one-to-one with many people about the Baha'i message. And then from about 1907 onwards, we also started to get talks about the Baha'i faith being held, addressing meetings of various organizations and articles appearing in journals, particularly by Alice Buckton and Tudor Pole, but also to some extent by Ethel Rosenberg. And each of these three, particularly Alice Buckton and Tudor Pole, were very well known in their social circles, which were on the fringes of the Church of England, so thoroughly respectable, but on the fringes. And this table is an indication of just how wide the reach of the British Baha'i community was. Down the left-hand column is all the different organizations and church groups and other groups that they were in contact with. The right-hand column gives the names of those British Baha'is that were in contact with these groups. And the middle column is the people who the Baha'is were in contact with in those groups and who subsequently were engaged. They managed to engage in interest in the Baha'i faith and engage in interest in Abdu'l-Baha's visit, and who worked towards promoting Abdu'l-Baha's visit. And this is quite an amazing list because all these people were very influential in the various groups that they were part of. They were the leading lights of those groups. And the number of British Baha'is was very small. We have a letter from Ethel Rosenberg in 1909 saying that there's never been at any time up to that date, 1909, more than 12 active Baha'is in London. So we're talking about a handful of people who had this tremendous impact. Now, the third, if we go back a couple of slides, as I said, one of the other factors was the newspaper coverage, that Abdu'l-Baha had a great amount of newspaper coverage while he was here. And this interested me because I was also aware that there had been other people, sort of what you might call sages from the East, who had come to London, and indeed in the last decade of the 19th century and the first 2 decades of the 20th century, this figure of the sage from the East coming and becoming a center of attention in London was something that was repeated time and again. It began with the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago. People like Vivekananda and Dharmapala visited London either on their way to the World Parliament of Religions or on their way back, and there was a great deal of newspaper interest. And then they came back again and again, and other figures came as well. So I was interested to see whether the amount of newspaper coverage accorded to Abdu'l-Baha was any more or less than that accorded to these other sages from the East. And what I did was to take three of the most prominent of these sages from the East, one from each of the three traditions, from the Hindu tradition, Vivekananda, from the Buddhist tradition, Dharmapala, and from Sufi Islamic tradition, Inayat Khan, and look at the newspaper coverage for these three. Again, I don't know whether you can see the bottom line of my slide, but I've given there the URL of the website that I use. There's a website of British newspapers. It's the digitalization of the British newspaper library, which has a very wide, although not total, coverage of the newspapers in Britain at that time, both national and local newspapers. And I did a search for these individuals in those newspapers. And I just to remind you that Abdu'l-Baha suffered from a number of disadvantages compared to these three sages. He spoke no English and had problems with his translators. We have a record of him having some problems with his translators, whereas the other three spoke English well and had no need of interpreters from the first day they arrived in the West. Two indeed had been educated in English language schools. They had Abdu'l-Baha had no experience of public speaking, whereas the others had extensive platform experience. They'd been to the World Parliament of Religion. Vivekananda had toured America after that, and on their subsequent visits they had in the meantime been doing making public addresses in Europe and in North America, so they had extensive experience. The other three came from the British Empire, and that was an important factor in Britain at that time. British people were interested in the empire, and somebody coming and claiming to speak on behalf of at least some of the peoples of that empire was something that interested a great many British people. It created a common bond and gave them a relevance which Abdu'l-Baha didn't have. The other three knew British culture because of their education and because they'd been raised in the British Empire. They knew at least something about British culture, which Abdu'l-Baha, again, was at a disadvantage to them. And the other three represented a known religious tradition. Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, these were known tradition, so their words carried weight as being representative of having the backing of a great civilization and a culture, whereas Abdu'l-Baha didn't come from the British Empire and didn't represent any religion that had a great civilization and culture and history behind it. So Abdu'l-Baha suffered from all of these disadvantages compared to the other three. But when we actually look at the figures and the relevant, it's quite a complex chart, but the relevant figures are the years down the left-hand side, which represent the repeated visits of each of these figures. Dharmapala came 5 times, Vivekananda 3, Inayat Khan 3, and Abdu'l-Baha twice. And then just look straight across to the right-hand side. This is both national and local newspapers. On the right-hand side, you can see that this is the number of items per week. An item is just a newspaper issue, an issue of a newspaper that has something about one of these figures that is not a paid advertisement. And so items per week, you can see that Abdu'l-Baha's figures are in a different league from the others. They are a lot higher than these other three figures. So Abdu'l-Baha, the question is, why is Abdu'l-Baha so much more reported in the newspapers, both at the local and national level, than these other figures, despite all of the disadvantages that Abdu'l-Baha had? And we can put together 2 or 3 theses as to why that might be. The first thesis we can put forward is that he had introductions and endorsements from these notable members of society, as I say, who had been in contact with the British Baha'is before Abdu'l-Baha's arrival, and then upon Abdu'l-Baha's arrival, the first who invited him to their churches, and Cheney and Carpenter invited Abdu'l-Baha to Oxford. So they had the endorsements and the introductions of these very prominent members of society. But the fact is that the other three sages also received similar endorsements and similar introductions. Vivekananda was brought to Oxford by Cheney and Estlin Carpenter, for example, and Vivekananda also received support from a number who were also later considered Baha'is, such as Lady Blomfield and Eric Hammond. Dharmapala had the support and endorsement of Sir William Arnold and Professor Rhys Davids of Oxford. Inayat Khan had the endorsement of Charlotte Despard, who also was one of the people who supported Abdu'l-Baha's visit. Lady de la Warre, who again was one of the ones who supported Abdu'l-Baha's visit, and Alice Callow of the Higher Thought Centre, which is one of the places that Abdu'l-Baha spoke at. And also the person who became Inayat Khan had the support of Beatrice Irwin, who later also became a follower of Abdu'l-Baha, actually during Abdu'l-Baha's visits, but in France, not in Britain. The second postulate, the second thesis we might put forward, that it was the charismatic personality of Abdu'l-Baha that produced all of this newspaper coverage. But again, there's points to be made against that. While it's true that a number of journal editors like Albert Dawson of the Christian Commonwealth and William Stead of the Review of Reviews did, and some newspaper journalists sent by their editors did visit Abdu'l-Baha and met with him. First of all, journals like Christian Commonwealth and Review of Reviews don't appear in the statistics that I showed you before. They were not considered newspapers and were not, or at least they're not in the analysis that I gave you before. And it wasn't, and the newspaper journalists, again, it wasn't the journalists who decide what goes into the newspaper. It's the newspaper editors who make the decision as to send out the reporters in the first place, and also then whether to put their report in the newspaper and the prominence to give to the items in the newspaper. And none of the major newspaper editors met Abdu'l-Baha. There's just one exception, which was Christabel Pankhurst, who edited the Suffragette, who did meet Abdu'l-Baha, or at least came to a talk of Abdu'l-Baha's, but that only resulted in one mention in that table that I showed you a couple of slides back. So again, the personality of Abdu'l-Baha does not seem to have been the reason for such a great newspaper coverage. So I think that the reason for this was this third reason that I'm going to give you, this third thesis, which was the relevance of what Abdu'l-Baha was saying to the public discourses of the time, the national discourses of the time. The other sages, their talks were mainly on mystic themes, often couched in concepts and words that were culturally unfamiliar to the British public. There was an audience for these sorts of things, for mysticism, but it was a small audience. There was only a very small proportion of the British public that was interested in these things. And although they sometimes talked about social themes, it was only if they were directly questioned about them that they were sort of forced to say something, and then they had nothing very much to say about it except sort of generally making a few general statements. Whereas Abdu'l-Baha, the main topics of his talks were generally about war and peace, about women's suffrage and the women's movement in general, and about poverty and tackling poverty in society. And he tackled these issues head on without being asked, and in a cogent and thought-provoking manner. And these were all discourses that were at the forefront of the national debate. These were issues that were constantly being aired in the newspapers, both at the national and local level. And so when newspaper editors saw the reports from their journalists that this is what Abdu'l-Baha had talked about, and they saw that it was cogent and relevant to the national debate that was going on, they of course put Abdu'l-Baha into their newspapers. And I think this was the reason that there was so much coverage of Abdu'l-Baha's talks while he was in Britain. So coming back to this question of why there was this tripling of numbers between 1911 and 1923, we can't prove that this first growth spurt was due to the visit of Abdu'l-Baha because we just don't have the data to back that up. But if we assume that that was the case, then the reasons why Abdu'l-Baha made such a great impact on British society, such as with the newspaper editors and those prominent people that we've just been talking about, may also have been what attracted the attention of those who joined the Baha'i community. We can put this forward as a thesis, but as I say, we've got no evidence that it actually happened. Okay, going on then to, as I say, there were these two growth spurts. So we're going on now to the second of these two growth spurts. As we said, that there was this tripling of numbers between 1911 and 23, and we've talked about the reasons for that. But what was the reason for the tripling between 1945 and 1950? Well, this was the period of the 6-year plan, which was of the British Baha'i community, which was between 1944 and 1950. But what happened during the 6-year plan to cause numbers to triple within this 5 or 6 year period? Again, we can put forward a number of theses. We could put forward the thesis that it was due to a change in the nature of the leadership of the community. In the 1930s, the old leadership, the older generation of Baha'is who had been the leading Baha'is at the time of Abdu'l-Baha, basically all passed away. Ethel Rosenberg in 1930, Mrs. Thornburg Cropper in 38, Lady Blomfield in 39, although all of these had become less effective in the last few years of their life. And this had opened up the space for a new generation who had no experience of the time of Abdu'l-Baha in Britain. They were all totally committed to Shoghi Effendi's vision. People like Hassan Baluzi, who came to this country in 1932, Dorothy Cansdale, who became a Baha'i in 1934, and David Hoffman, who became a Baha'i in the United States but came to this country in 1936. And we have some inkling that this was a change from something that was written on behalf of Shoghi Effendi, of something that he indicates that he was hoping for and that these new generation of leaders delivered. This is a letter written on the behalf of Shoghi Effendi in 1929, and he writes that he is much hopeful of your new centre in Regent Street or thereabouts, and he trusts that it will mark a turning point in the history of the cause in England, from happy tea parties at individual homes into a group of less personal but eager, active and thoughtful workers cooperating in a common service. And that really is exactly what happened. The reference to happy tea parties at individual homes was really what was going on in the time of Abdu'l-Baha. All of the activities that were going on were individual initiatives, people inviting people to their homes and talking to them about the faith. And what Shoghi Effendi is hoping for, and what did happen, was that it became a much more cooperative, collaborative venture, and with a great deal more energy in the teaching work. So the second reason that we can think of is, the first one was the change in the leadership. The second we can say was we can surmise was what the last line says, and I don't know whether you can see or not, is that all of this occurred in the 1930s. So I don't think it was actually relevant to what was happening in 1944 to 1950. So although it is a factor, it isn't a factor for the spurt of growth in 1944 to 1950. The second theory that we can come up is that teaching became much more the prime focus of the community, which it hadn't been so much in earlier years, and much more systematic and sustained. So we have goal towns being picked, pioneers going to those goal towns, the introduction of firesides, the idea of having newspaper campaigns in a particular town, visiting and traveling teachers on a systematic basis, and the creation of a national teaching committee to focus on all of these things. So, and I should just say that most of this was ideas coming from North America, where they were being tried out, and then North American Baha'is would come through Britain on their way to visit Shoghi Effendi, for example, and talk about these ideas, and the British Baha'is would take them up. And people obviously like David Hoffman and so on were also coming to this country and introducing these ideas. And Marion Holly, who became Marion Hoffman, also came over from North America, and at the end of the North American first 7-year plan, and she also brought a lot of these ideas to Britain. But the fact is that all of these had already been implemented before 1939, and indeed there'd even been a systematic plan before the 6-year plan. There'd been a 4-year plan begun in 1940 by the British NSA. So the idea of a systematic plan and the idea of all of these teaching activities were all things that had been tried out in the 1930s and 1940s and have not resulted in a spurt in growth. So they can't, I don't think they can be the reason for this spurt in growth during the 6-year plan. So going on to the third reason, which I think is actually the reason for this spurt in growth, was the changing relationship to Shoghi Effendi. Now, Shoghi Effendi had been the head of the Baha'i faith since the passing of Abdu'l-Baha in 1921, and the British Baha'is were obedient to Shoghi Effendi. They obeyed him as the head of the faith. But what began to change in this period, 1944 to 1950, is that whereas previously Shoghi Effendi had set instructions and the British Baha'is had by and large carried them out, but what happened in 1944 was the British Baha'is actually turned to Shoghi Effendi and asked for guidance, and Shoghi Effendi started responding to that request for guidance and sending them specific guidance in response to what they had asked for. And you can see this change in the British Baha'i Journal, where you start to get a pattern whereby the first page of the Baha'i of each issue has a letter of Shoghi Effendi giving certain amount of advice in response to what he has picked up from what was coming from the British Baha'i community, followed then by reflection of the National Spiritual Assembly on the letter, followed by advice from the National Teaching Committee on how to carry out what Shoghi Effendi had instructed. And so as a result of all of this turning to Shoghi Effendi, there was gradually the emergence of an attitude of love and reverence for Shoghi Effendi. This had been present among a small leadership group such as David and Marion Hoffman, Philip Hainsworth, Hassan Sabri, but these young people started to then take it to the community. They went round the community, they became traveling teachers who traveled around the community, and they took this attitude of love and reverence for Shoghi Effendi to the different Baha'i communities and instilled it in the Baha'is. And for example, Marion Hoffman, writing after visiting Shoghi Effendi, wrote, "The depth and wonder of his nature, the sharpness and poignancy of his feelings, the weight of his inconceivable burdens, his sufferings, his sacrifice, the fullness and magnitude of his dedication." These words about Shoghi Effendi, one wouldn't have been surprised at seeing them written about Abdu'l-Baha, but it was new for the Baha'is to be writing in this manner about Shoghi Effendi, and that happened during this period, 1944 to 1950. So, and also during this period, it became common to refer to Shoghi Effendi as the beloved guardian. Again, there had been some occasional references to the beloved guardian prior to 1944, but it became the standard way of referring to Shoghi Effendi. And it was this changing relationship to Shoghi Effendi, this changing change from just obedience to actually love and reverence for Shoghi Effendi that I think was the key to what produced that growth spurt. So we have the difference between this 4-year plan that started in 1940. First of all, it was a goal of 19 local assemblies, and this 4-year plan was conceived of and given to the British Baha'is by the National Assembly. And as a result of that plan, they achieved none of the 19 local assemblies and no growth in number of Baha'is. Whereas during the 6-year plan, with this changing attitude towards Shoghi Effendi, at the start of this period in 1944, they actually turned to Shoghi Effendi and asked him to set the goals of the plan. He set exactly the same goals, 19 local assemblies, but added that one should be in each of Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland. And the Baha'is achieved it, and they achieved a quadrupling in the number of assemblies and a tripling in the number of Baha'is. So I think this was the key thing, this turning to Shoghi Effendi, this attitude of love and reverence for Shoghi Effendi that produced this remarkable result. And at the end of the plan in 1950, this is the cable of Shoghi Effendi that he sent, and I just acknowledging that they had achieved the goals of the plan, and starts off heart flooded with joy at striking evidence, bountiful grace of Baha'u'llah enabling valorous, dearly loved Baha'i community triumphantly conclude first historic plan of half-century of British Baha'i history. And I want to particularly focus on the fact on the sentences or the phrases outlined in red, where Shoghi Effendi is saying what these achievements were. This achievement that they had made was unrivaled in the annals of any Baha'i community on the European continent. Now, this is slightly interesting. This is of interest because the German community up to the start of the Second World War was the largest Baha'i community in Europe, and in many ways the most active. And the French Baha'i community had been, in the time of Abdu'l-Baha, the largest and most active community. And yet Shoghi Effendi says that this achievement of the British Baha'i community was unrivaled in the annals of any community on the European continent. And then the next phrase is even more interesting because it says an unparalleled percentage of members of the community responding to pioneer call throughout the Baha'i world. So unparalleled in the Baha'i world, the number responding to the pioneer call. And I wanted to look and see, well, what was the percentage of Baha'is who responded to the pioneer call that Shoghi Effendi says is unparalleled throughout the Baha'i world. And so I started to look at the numbers, and this proved slightly more complicated than you might think, because the number of British Baha'is during that period, as I say, was an almost tripling from around about 120, 118, 120 to 342. And we can say that there had been, we know there were 85 pioneers. Some of them, 25 of the pioneers moved more than once. So there were actually 126 pioneer moves during the plan. But if we just take that number of 85, do you use as your base the number of Baha'is at the start of the plan, which was 120? If you do, you get 72% pioneered, which is a very high number. And indeed, if you look at the names of the pioneers, most of the pioneers who pioneered during the 6-year plan were already Baha'is at the start of the plan. Or you can base your percentage of those pioneering on the number of Baha'is at the end of the plan, which was 342, which resulted in 25% having pioneered. Or you can base it on an average number of Baha'is during this period, which would result in a figure of 40% having pioneered. So all three of those figures, you can take whichever of those you think is the fairest, but Shoghi Effendi calls this an unparalleled percentage of the community anywhere in the world pioneering. So I want to just go on to a couple of reflections about this. So I want to put it to you that it was the change from a relationship of obedience to Shoghi Effendi as head of the faith to a relationship of love towards Shoghi Effendi that resulted in this sudden increase in the number of Baha'is, this activity that resulted in that. And I want to perhaps reflect on the fact that maybe this is a parallel to Baha'u'llah's words, observe my commandments for love of my beauty. So the British Baha'is changed from observing the instructions coming from Shoghi Effendi as being an observing of commandments, and changed to an observation because of a relationship of love. So we might come to the conclusion that the operation of the covenant should be a matter of love rather than duty of obedience to the head of the faith, and that changing from one to the other produces an energizing effect that enabled the British Baha'is to have that remarkable change, spurt of growth. And another reflection is that maybe this is also a reflection of the coming of age of humanity. It's a move from a paradigm of God as the parent to be obeyed to the paradigm of a relationship of the lover and the beloved, and similar change in paradigm from towards the head of the faith. And it can also be, we can think of it as being paralleled by a change in the relationship between the institutions of the faith and the Baha'is. If we go from a stage where we're just obeying the institutions of the faith out of obedience, move towards consultation and cooperation and an attitude of love towards those institutions, would that produce this galvanizing effect that the British Baha'is experienced in the 6-year plan if we change our attitude towards the institutions of the faith, and of course particularly towards the Universal House of Justice as the center of the covenant. So that's one. And the second point that I want to make is that this second growth spurt between 1945 and 1950, I've suggested, is due to the establishment of a bond of love between the Baha'is and Shoghi Effendi. But perhaps this first growth spurt between 1911 and 1923 was also a result of this establishment of a bond of love. We've seen that there's very little evidence that it was the actual physical presence of Abdu'l-Baha and meeting Abdu'l-Baha or attending his talks that produced this growth, the first growth spurt between 1911 and 1923. But could it be that, parallel to the reason for the second growth spurt, Abdu'l-Baha's visit enabled the Western Baha'is to establish a personal bond of love with the center of the covenant, because most of the Western Baha'is had not been to Accra and visited Abdu'l-Baha, so they had no direct experience of Abdu'l-Baha, but when he came to the West, established a personal bond of love with the rest of the Baha'is, or the majority of the Baha'is who had not visited him in Accra. That this established a personal bond of love, and that then over the next few years resulted in more intense personal teaching, as happened with the second growth spurt, where the establishment of a bond of love resulted in a more intensive teaching effort that resulted in large numbers becoming Baha'is. Maybe the first growth spurt was a similar sort of process, that this bond was established during Abdu'l-Baha's visits in 1911 and 1912 and 13, but the result of this, the intensification of the teaching effort resulting from this change in relationship, might have been played out over the next few years and resulted in the growth that we saw in the first growth spurt. So that's a suggestion. I've got no way of proving it. I've got no way of that there is no evidence for it, but there is no evidence for anything else either. So it's as good a theory as any, I would say. And personally, I think it's possibly the right one. Okay, thank you. That's it. Shall we go back to, yes?
Thank you, Moojan. That's fascinating. And it's, I think, a very interesting contrast from the situation in the United States, which makes me rethink all the information that we have about the United States as well. In terms of the growth of the faith during Abdu'l-Baha's visit, I'm aware of, I think I was aware of maybe, I don't know whether it was 12 or 20 people, 25 people who became Baha'is while Abdu'l-Baha was in the US. It was not a huge number at all. A lot of the people who say they became Baha'is during Abdu'l-Baha's visit, on the historical record cards in 1935, about two-thirds of the American Baha'is completed these historical record cards. And a fair number of people said they became a Baha'i in 1912, but they were mostly children of Baha'is who were maybe 6 when Abdu'l-Baha was there, or 10 when Abdu'l-Baha was there. And it was meeting Abdu'l-Baha that, for them, cemented their relationship. And so they considered 1912 the year they became a Baha'i. But in terms of new people, it wasn't a huge number. On the other hand, the number of Baha'is in the US probably was pretty flat from 1912 to the mid-20s. So we don't really have clear evidence of what was going on. And then after 22 or 23, when there were local spiritual assemblies, there was now actually a community to join. And so the number of Baha'is seemed to have begun to go up. And it went from, say, 1,200 or 1,500 in 1922 to, I think, 2,500 by the mid-30s and 5,000 by 1934. But again, we don't have the breakdown of how many became Baha'is each year very, very clearly. The historical
do you not have voting lists for each election of the Baha'i Temple Unity and then the National Assembly?
We don't have the local voting. Well, we might have local voting lists, but no one's ever tried to pull them all together, because we're talking about, very quickly 20, 30, 50, 60, 70 assemblies.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many of them.
In Britain, the voting list was and still is constructed on a national level and sent out to the local Baha'is.
I don't think it was at that point, though. I'm not sure when that started in the United States. Now, yes. What we do have is, again, the historical record cards when people said they became Baha'is at different years. And it's quite interesting to note that when the Great Depression begins in the fall of 1929, the number of people who report themselves becoming Baha'is in 1930 is double the number in 1929. And when the Great Depression hit its bottom in 32, the number of people who reported being becoming Baha'is in 32 was double the number in 31 or double the number in 30. So it appears that the social shock of the Depression may have increased enrollments, but then there may be other things going on too. I don't know. And this raises some very interesting questions. I'm going to have to look at this data from a whole new point of view, actually, because I think you raised some very interesting questions. Now, I gather that you have basically a data point for 1911 and a data point for number of Baha'is in 1923, but no data in between.
Yeah. No, I don't. That's exactly right. And the data point for 1911 is just me putting together a list of every known Baha'i. But I think it's an accurate list because, well, for various reasons. But we also have this letter from Ethel Rosenberg saying there were only 12 Baha'is in 1909, 12 active Baha'is in 1909 in London. So that gives us an additional sort of security about the figures.
And it seems to me I saw some numbers for numbers of Baha'is in London. There was a London Baha'i Council formed during the war?
No, well, that's a question mark. Abdu'l-Baha gave instructions that a Baha'i council should be formed. And yes, a Baha'i council was formed, but it wasn't an elected council. It was an appointed. Abdu'l-Baha said who should be on the council. It operated briefly just before the war. Abdu'l-Baha gave this instruction in 1911. As far as I can tell, it didn't come into existence until just before the First World War. They had a number of meetings before the First World War. Then it went into abeyance, and Abdu'l-Baha, when Esselmont went to Haifa, Abdu'l-Baha instructed him to start it up again, and he came back and started it up again. But again, it wasn't an elected council. It didn't become an elected council, and there are no voting lists for it until a year before the National Assembly came into being. So it was 1922. We have a voting list for the London Assembly, and then the National Assembly came into being in 1923.
And it's the 1922 voting list that you have that give you the number.
It's actually 1922 to 3, because we've got the voting list for 22, but we don't have figures for Manchester and Bournemouth until 23. So right. It's a combination of the two.
Got it. And not that many believers outside of Bournemouth, Greater London, and Manchester.
Yeah, that was just a scattering in other places. I mean, there had been a few sort of promising starts. Daniel Jenkin down in Cornwall had got 2 or 3 people together, but then he passed away. There was a starting of something in Leeds around that time, but again, nothing very much. And some of the Baha'is were sort of living out in the countryside, but within commuting distance of London. So the boundaries of the London community were very wide. People living, 40 or 50 miles away were counted as being part of the London Baha'i community.
That was true in the United States as well. The city boundaries were not being followed. People were in the suburbs were being considered members of the city, in Boston in particular, and I think in Washington D.C. and Chicago actually. So yeah, that's
yes. I mean, the 1922 voting list for the London Baha'i Council had stars against the name of some of the names, saying that these people lived so far away that it would not be practical for them to be voted for, because they couldn't attend the meetings.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. Steve asks a couple of questions. Were there any particular Baha'is in British history who moved from community to community? There are Baha'is in the United States who undertook this kind of practice across the 1922 to 1950 period.
Yes, I mean, this idea of sort of traveling around. So it depends on whether you're talking about just going from one community to another and just giving a brief talk and going on to another one and giving a talk, or whether you're talking about actually going and settling in one community and sort of raising it up and then going to another community. But all of these sort of things were happening to a small extent in the 1910s and 1920s, but it was in the 1930s that it really took off, that visiting teachers on a systematic basis began to happen. And as I say, it was really a reflection of what was going on in the United States. The ideas were coming across from the States and being implemented by the British Baha'is. And as I say, this really happened in the 1930s, that these sort of ideas, that it should happen on a systematic basis. Previously, individual Baha'is had visited other Baha'is. Ethel Rosenberg, as early as 1903, visited Manchester and to support the Manchester, the one lady in Manchester, and raise up a community there. And she was instrumental in raising up a community there. So, it happened from as early as 1903, but on a sort of systematic level, not to the 1930s.
Yeah, Shoghi Effendi, when he was at Oxford, traveled around that way.
Yes.
Visited Manchester, visited London.
Yeah. And Dr. Esselmont visited Manchester and Birmingham, and there were a number of people who did that sort of visiting, but on an individual initiative, not on a sort of planned, systematic basis, and only for a single trip, not sort of going not on a sort of repeatedly yearly basis going around. Whereas
Go ahead.
So I was saying, whereas, for example, we even have examples of American Baha'is who annually made a trip to Britain and went around. I can't remember her first name, Ford.
Mary Hanford Ford?
Yeah, Mary Hanford Ford, I think, came for 3 or 4 years in a row to Britain and travelled around. And of course, people like Martha Root came and the year of the Esperanto conference in Edinburgh, and she travelled around. So there were also American Baha'is who did this travel teaching, and also Iranian Baha'is in 1913. Abdu'l-Baha sent Mirza Ali Akbar Rafsanjani, who traveled around to various communities and helped to increase their knowledge of the faith.
Marco asks about the impact of John Esselmont himself on the Baha'i community in Britain, and also his book Baha'u'llah and the New Era. What sort of impact did it have? Well, how was it received?
Well, Esselmont was, sort of an active Baha'i almost from the moment he became a Baha'i. He started giving talks about the faith in Bournemouth, where he lived, and built up a Bournemouth Baha'i community. He was also, he became a member after the war. As I say, he actually started up the Baha'i Council and was a member of it. They had members elected, 9 members I think was elected from the London Baha'is, and 1 representative from Bournemouth and 1 representative from Manchester. So the council had this sort of national feel to it, even though it was actually a London Baha'i council. And in fact Esselmont and the Manchester representatives were appointed by Shoghi Effendi to the council. So Esselmont was active, and as I say, he visited Birmingham, he visited Manchester, so he also did, and he was very frequently in London. He came up for the council meetings, for example, and stayed for a few days afterwards and gave talks at the talk. There was one public talk each week in London in a public hall, and he would and whenever he came up to London, he would often give talks at this public meeting that was being held. So he had a great impact, but unfortunately it was only for a very brief period of time. I mean, by the time he was sort of doing these things, he was already quite ill, and then he went to Haifa to in effect become Shoghi Effendi's secretary in Haifa, and of course he then died. So unfortunately his duration of his activities for the Baha'i community in Britain was only about a decade, just over a decade. But he had a very significant impact in that decade, and the book itself, of course, well, it if you like, sealed this change in. This is a separate talk, really, so I haven't got time to compress it into 5 minutes. But it sealed the change in the presentation of the faith from being one of fulfillment of prophecy and theology and these sorts of things, which was the way the faith was presented prior to Abdu'l-Baha's Western journeys. And then with Abdu'l-Baha's Western journeys, Abdu'l-Baha started this sort of the Baha'i faith as a social movement, as a progressive social movement, and the idea of the 12 principles and all of these things emerged from Abdu'l-Baha's talks during his Western journeys. And then Baha'u'llah and the New Era really set the seal on that, because it became the textbook of the faith and it presented the faith as a social movement. There had been one previous book, Horace Holly's Baha'i, the Modern Social Movement, but it wasn't as systematic as Esselmont's book, and Shoghi Effendi took a major part in sort of encouraging people to use Esselmont's book and translate it into numerous languages and so on. So under Shoghi Effendi's guidance, really, it became the textbook of the faith and had an enormous impact. Last year was actually the centenary of the publication of Esselmont's Baha'u'llah and the New Era, and we had a small ceremony for that at the Afnan Library when we launched the book as well. So the book, we had a sort of joint launching of the book and also commemorating the book on Baha'i history that I was referred to at the beginning of my presentation. So we had a joint launch of that book and commemorating Shoghi Esselmont's publication of his Baha'u'llah and the New Era.
Fantastic. Steve also asks whether the Baha'is of Britain had any kind of initiative like the Historical Record Card Initiative in the United States, where Baha'is were asked to fill out a sort of like a census form.
Not really, no. The closest thing we've got to that is that at the beginning of the Second World War, the the National Assembly, or rather the probably just the Secretary of the National Assembly and a couple of others, received a visit from the police saying that because people would be claiming exemption from military service on account of being Baha'is, it was necessary for the Baha'is to issue some sort of membership card so that the genuine Baha'is could be distinguished from people who might be jumping on the bandwagon in the hope of getting out of military service. And so at the beginning of the Second World War, the Baha'is issued these identity cards which had on them the date of birth, not much other information, obviously where the Baha'i was living at the time, date of birth. It didn't have when they became Baha'is, so that wasn't on there. But it was at least something that we know who are the Baha'is at that date, because they had cards issued to them and what their date of birth was as a result, and their occupation. Yes, that was the other thing that was very interesting. So at that point in time, we had a complete list of the Baha'is plus their occupation and their date of birth. So that was the closest that we have to that.
That's quite useful, actually. One person says here, the idea that transitioning from obedience to love for the center of the covenant led to greater activity and enrollments is compelling. What evidence is there of this happening in other Baha'i communities? Or even how can one be sure of it in Britain, for that matter?
Well, as I said, I can't, because we just don't have the data to prove it in terms of Abdu'l-Baha's visit. But I presented the evidence for the second growth spurt during the 6-year plan, that there really is no other explanation. The other explanations that you might think of had already been present prior to that period of 6 years, and so they couldn't have been the impetus for the growth spurt in that period. And the only other thing that happened was this noticeable change that you can see from the records in the Baha'i Journal in particular, and statements like Marian Hoffman's statement about Shoghi Effendi, that there was a change in attitude, that Shoghi Effendi became a different leader of the Baha'i faith in Britain compared to what he was in the 1920s and 30s. I'll give you an example of that. Perhaps I shouldn't. It's the fact that the British National Assembly felt quite able, for example, in the 1920s, to ignore something that Shoghi Effendi asked them to do, which they would have dreamed of doing in the 1940s, where during this 6-year plan. This was a reprint of Hidden Words. Shoghi Effendi asked them not to reprint it until the stocks of the American publication had been, as it were, used up, and they went ahead and reprinted it anyway. So I mean, that was the sort of attitude. Well, I mean, that was just one example. You can't say this was happening all the time, but
Sure.
but it does give you a glimpse into the thinking of the National Assembly in the 1920s. That they did obey Shoghi Effendi in almost every other respect, but the fact that they felt that they could do this gives a slightly different impression of their attitude to Shoghi Effendi than the attitude during the 6-year plan. So I think there is evidence of a change in attitude to the Shoghi Effendi during the 6-year plan, and the impact that had. So I think there is good evidence for that.
To what extent was the 6-year plan encouraged and shaped by the Guardian as opposed to decisions by the National Spiritual Assembly?
Well, as I said, it was really the whole plan was as a result of the National Assembly turning, or it's actually the National Convention decided to turn to Shoghi Effendi and ask for a plan. And they actually got the reply from Shoghi Effendi while the convention was still in session, saying that he, he set this goal of 19 assemblies. So they actually got their response immediately. And so there was this turning to Shoghi Effendi, and from then onwards they were constantly turning to Shoghi Effendi for advice, and Shoghi Effendi was responding with these letters, and these letters then became the centerpiece of the journal and the sort of centerpiece of the deliberations of the National Assembly. And the National Teaching Committee was sort of tasked with then coming up with practical ways of implementing what Shoghi Effendi was asking them to do. So it became the focus, but it was also this turning to Shoghi Effendi for guidance. It wasn't just a one-way process, if you like. The National Assembly was letting Shoghi Effendi know the problems it was facing, and then Shoghi Effendi was coming back with advice about that.
So this was Rezvan 1944.
Yeah.
During the war still. That's quite interesting.
Yeah.
And how many local assemblies were there? So 19 was
5.
Huh? 5.
5, yes.
And how many did they achieve?
24, yes, 24. 19 new ones.
Oh, 19 new ones. Okay.
19 new ones. So there was the 5 original ones, and then Shoghi Effendi asked them to do 19 new ones, and they achieved that in 5 years, and in 6 years. Yes, in 6 years, and also one in each of Scotland, Northern Ireland, Ireland, and Wales, which took some doing, because to establish assemblies in these sort of what were for the British Baha'is far off remote locations was itself quite an achievement.
Oh, interesting. I'm looking to see if we have any other questions, and I don't see any more. But I'm struck by the fact that their 6-year plan in many ways paralleled the first 7-year plan in the U.S. with a goal of number of assemblies in different places. The U.S., of course, was supposed to create one and at least have one in every state. But of course, we had overseas goals as well, and it sounds like the British 6-year plan was purely domestic.
Yeah, purely
which
domestic.
Makes sense with the war, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, well, as Shoghi Effendi said in that letter to the Canadian Baha'is, the British Baha'is were emerging from a war situation. Their financial resources were very restricted. They themselves had tough war years. It was Britain, London was being bombed for most of the war, in fact, and other places like Manchester also had some bombing, and Birmingham had very extensive bombing, and so they were emerging from that situation, and the achievement was quite a major achievement, really. No, they didn't have any overseas goals. That came in the next, because immediately this finished, Shoghi Effendi gave them 1 year's grace and then gave them the Africa campaign. So the overseas goals came in the next tranche of plans, and obviously the 10-year crusade after that.
Right. Very interesting. Any comments? A little bit of time we have left. Do you have any comments about the growth spurts that happened later, like in the 60s and 70s? Have you researched them?
No, I haven't looked at them in any great depth to come up with anything new in the way of ideas. I mean, obviously the sort of ideas that have already been expressed by other people, that there was a culture change in the 1960s among the youth in society, and in a sense that made the Baha'i teachings much more palatable and much more amenable for the youth, and so therefore the young people who were sort of teaching, the young Baha'is who were teaching their fellow youth were sort of knocking against an open door that was much easier. I mean, these sort of things have been said by other people, but I haven't done any in-depth research to say, is that it, or is there more to the story than that?
Right. And that's a really interesting question that I hope we'll be able to turn to in some other broadcast in the future, if not about Britain or the United States but about other countries. Certainly, Margaret Varberg has done a lot of research about the growth of the faith in Denmark, for example, and other countries. So there is some research that's been done on this.
Yeah.
Don't see any other questions at the moment. So I want to thank you very much for joining us, Moojan, today. And I want to thank everyone for joining the Korin True Center for Baha'i Studies. In 2 weeks, we'll be hearing, maybe it's 3 weeks, we'll be hearing from Joanne Borovica about the understanding of the Bible that is presented by Abdu'l-Baha and Baha'u'llah when they quote biblical stories, whether they're actually providing a literal kind of understanding of these texts or whether they're using these texts based on people's own understandings to make a further point that's not historically literal or something. So that will be a very interesting discussion, I think. And again, I want to thank everyone for joining us and hope to see you again in a few weeks. Thanks again, Moojan.
Thank you.
Goodbye for now.
Bye.